And we're live. What's up, everybody? I am BillyJitsu from Developer DAO Community Manager and Hackathon Lead. I have the pleasure of introducing Coding with Manny. You guys know who it is, the guy that keeps winning hackathons, got the big check.
Yeah.
You know, awesome to have a pleasure of like a senior dev here at this caliber to be able to show us like the ins and outs of Postman, how it works. You know, we're going to have tons of questions. Please ask a ton of questions because Manny's the guy to ask, right? So enough of me. Manny, take over. You are take the wheel.
Awesome. So let me know when you give me the okay in terms of vocal check. If you can see this, fine.
You sound good. I'm gonna set it up. Bam. Postman with Manny. We ready?
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about Postman, going over just like the ins and outs of how I've typically used it in teams, specifically when it comes to working with agencies or different projects for that matter. It has evolved a lot since I have been using it in that sense. So there's a ton of different features to it as well. But briefly about myself, again, Coding with Manny. I'm a DevRel engineer as well as I've been a tech lead and also been in tech for probably close to 16 years. So definitely give me a follow and we'll jump right into it. So first thing is like, what is Postman? That's right. What is Postman? So most people understand, or at least talking to devs specifically, they think that Postman is just an API client for RESTful APIs, SOAP APIs, GraphQL, even gRPC. You can do gRPC queries as well within Postman, and that's like the major part when they think of, hey, I need to test a specific endpoint out, and they're like, hey, I'm just going to use Postman or whatnot. And sometimes people think about it and they're like, oh, well, why would I use Postman? There's so much to it. Like I just need to do an API endpoint test in that sense. But Postman is not just an API client. It's a platform. And you got to think of it like if you're going to be building out an API specifically for production, dealing with teams, etc., you have a lot of different aspects to it in terms of flow, monitoring. You can create docs with it in terms of, hey, you've created all your endpoints, etc. You can actually generate docs with it and share it with other developers. You can create mock designs. So basically, you can go through the process of saying, hey, before you even code anything, I'm going to actually create the endpoints and what I should expect so that maybe the front end and the back end from a team perspective, we can kind of agree what that schema looks like if it's a RESTful API or maybe even for GraphQL as well, to kind of see, hey, this is the things that you should expect for those payloads in terms of environment. On top of being a client, you can do a lot of different tests. And one other aspect when you're working with teams, and again, this is the premium aspect to Postman, is the versioning aspect of it. So you can actually have multiple people work on the same collection of API endpoints that you've kind of created and create different versions of it to make sure that you're most up to date. So think of it almost like Git and Git commits that you can kind of add to specifically for tests and API endpoints going forward. So Postman is like much more than just an API client. So where can you get it? Obviously, postman.com/downloads. It used to be Get Postman for the longest time, but it looks like they made bank and bought postman.com. So again, it's native to any platform. You can get it on Mac OS, Windows. You can even use it in the browser. That's what's great about it, is you can almost use it anywhere. One thing to note about this, though, specifically, is that Postman is an online tool, right? There's not necessarily, and I think that they might be working on the offline aspect of it, but the reason why they have it as an online tool is that you do need a connection to the internet, is to allow you to be able to keep in sync all your API endpoints so that if your computer crashes here, you can pick it up somewhere else and be able to kind of pick up where you left off when it comes to those API endpoints that you're working on. So how do we use it? We're going to jump into code. So enough of these presentations. And the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to look at this repository that I created today called GitHub with Manny /coding with Manny, github.com/coding with Manny, Postman getting started. And we're going to use this repository to kind of get started and show you what that looks like in terms of the different code and what we're going to be dealing with to be able to create some Postman tests. All right. So let us jump into the code just to be able to kind of give you an idea of what we're dealing with. So this is a Next.js app, a 13 app router scaffolded application. So something very, very simple, just so you guys can understand what the tech is behind here in terms of creating the endpoint. So you very, very briefly get the idea of what's going on. We have an API folder, basically, that has everything from to-dos, health Z, as well as an authorization that we're going to be going over very basic to kind of get what that looks like too. And this is using SQLite with Prisma to be able to store those to-dos, etc., in a database locally. So there's no UI to this. This is all an API in terms of a REST API endpoints. And I use Next.js because it'll be a lot easier if you get started with that. You could use Express. It's the same process. You could use TRPC, you could use GraphQL, but for the purposes of this workshop, we're going to be going over a standard RESTful API application. So let's jump into getting the server started. But before I jump into it, Billy, do you have any questions, or anybody have any questions in regards to what this repository is, or for that matter?
No, so far so good. I'm ready to get into the code. I just put a video. If you have any comments or questions, I linked the GitHub in the chat on YouTube, so you can always grab it and fork it, or just kind of follow along if you choose, or if you want to come back to the video and look at it. So I think we're good to keep moving forward.
Awesome. So the first thing you'll probably do is copy the environment variable file. And this is just a standard thing that just refers to the local SQLite database. So in this case, it's just referring to basically under Prisma and our dev.db file or whatnot for the migrations. And you can kind of see what the schema looks like just to kind of give you an overview. It's a to-do. There's a task, which is a string. Is it complete? Is a Boolean created and updated at in terms of what the dates mechanisms look like? So very, 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 very simple. Even created a seeding script so that you can go through and it'll create random tasks, whether or not it's complete or incomplete, and just store that in the database as well. So I've already gone through the process of being able to store those, and we can kind of see what that looks like. So I'm going to run npm DB Studio or npx Prisma Studio, and we'll load this up on localhost 5500, 5555 rather, and you can kind of see these are all the to-dos that have been set. A UUID for it, the task, whether or not it's complete or not. Okay, so that said, let's stop this and let's just start our server. And
as we're starting the server, we do have a question. How does it compare to Insomnia?
Yeah, so Insomnia is definitely another API client. There's even Thunder client. There's a few other ones. I think the major thing is that a lot of people felt like there was so many features with Postman that they wanted a lighter version of that. So Insomnia is a great tool as well if you want to go and create API endpoints. I think what Postman does is that it's really set up as a service, because if you're dealing with teams and sharing all these other assets, like in terms of the API endpoints, going through tests, doing mocks, it's all that entire suite that's just like a lot more than what normally you would see in terms of Insomnia in that sense, right? I won't say that I use Insomnia like a ton, but from my perspective, it's been like a straightforward API client. And from Postman, it's just been a ton more in terms of being able to collaborate with other developers as well.
So you would say like Insomnia is like if you just want to get your hands a little dirty messing with some specific usages, then you would say Insomnia. And then when you want to get into the nitty-gritty and start expanding on it, Postman might be the way.
Yeah, I mean, everybody chooses their tool. Again, you choose Node or Rust or Go. You know what I mean? Like everybody prefers. If you're a solo developer, I think it'd probably be great. There probably is ways to be able to share that, and I'm going to show even ways in terms of Postman how you can kind of share those collections or those tests for those endpoints.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really your preference. I know people who love Insomnia love Postman or love like just simple Thunder client or PAW. Like that, there's a ton of HTTP clients or whatnot to be able to kind of perform tests on too.
Gotcha. All right. Like when I'm coding stuff, I just have Insomnia. So either way, I'm good. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what most of these clients do, and this is probably something to kind of factor in, is there is a standard, which is the Open API schema. So a lot of the times you can actually export those collections in a specific format that can be imported cross-platform through all these API clients. So that's another way to kind of prevent vendor lock-in. So if you wanted to, you could kind of export it in that specific format too. So yeah, let's jump in. So I want to run this like the dev server and just kind of show you what a endpoint looks like. So I'm just going to start a new window and API health Z. Let me just So you can kind of see what this looks like. It's really just an API endpoint that returns true. This is typically for DevOps. If you have that endpoint for health Z, this is just going to do like a health check specifically on the server. So let's go to to-dos, and we should get a list back of an array of all the to-dos that are within the database in that sense. So we kind of see that our server is running, and we're going to jump over to Postman now to be able to kind of create our first request. So let's jump over here. So when you're in Postman, typically what happens is you'll probably be presented with a screen. There's a lot going on. There's definitely like if you're the first time coming to it, you're like, where do I go? What am I supposed to do in that sense, right? I would advise go directly to your workspaces. Okay, this is where you're going to basically say, this is where everything I'm going to do for the work I'm doing for I know a specific project. That's what that looks like. So I'm going to create a new one. Let's call it using a blank workspace. So my new workshop space workspace, and I'm going to do it personal. You can create them private. You can do teams. You can actually invite people, and you can even make them public for people to kind of access from a public URL. So let's just create this. So here I'm in my workspace, and the first thing you can kind of notice is like there's collections, environments, and they've done a pretty good job of hiding some other features. But this is to kind of showcase all the other features that Postman has to offer that you could go through as well. But the first thing you'll probably end up doing is standard. This is myself, if I'm going to test out a new API, like I'm testing out something on Twitter, or I'm testing something out on, Auth0 or any type of service, the first thing I'm going to do is probably open up a new request. So the first thing I'm going to do here is that this supports almost like every standard HTTP method. So you have your get, post, put, patch, delete, head, and options, right? So this is pretty standard. It follows the idea that I'm going to perform an HTTP request to a specific URL and then get a response. So let's use that healthz URL as a starting point to be able to say, hey, I want to be able to see what that looks like in here. So I'll do get request, and we can kind of see that the data is set to true. So this is pretty standard. You can kind of see, we'll dissect this as to what that looks like. We will notice that in here we have our body. We can actually see that as a raw, like the raw data specifically. We can see what a preview looks like when we're going directly to the web. And pretty is to be able to say, hey, it reads the headers, which we can kind of see here, where the content type is set to application JSON. And what
Manny,
that's
sorry, Manny. Can we make the screen a little bit larger, because it's kind of hard to see for me in general? Yeah, there we go.
There we
Help
go.
my old eyes.
So we have like the data, it's parsing it as JSON. And that's typically it's reading it from the headers that are returned from the actual server itself. You'll also notice that in this is all the payloads, everything that's being returned. We have also some metrics on the right-hand side. So the status code, so 200 for saying, hey, this was a successful request. What the metrics in terms of speed is as it relates to that request. We can even save these payloads to be able to share it. I've had cases where developers, I'm working with them and they're like, hey, can you send the payload to me? So I will save that and then send it to them to be able to debug to see what the actual results are, as opposed to trying to do a copy paste. You can just save the file and then send it to them too. So here we can also see that there's cookies associated to this. And what I'll go back to our code just quickly. If we look under our healthz route, I created a small cookie to be able to say, hey, hello there, and it's set up to HTTP only. So you can also parse the cookies that are coming through from the request in a nice way so that it's a lot easier to read and to kind of debug in that sense. So if we move back here, we'll see that hello there, the path, it's set to a session, HTTP true. And what's nice is that when you set the same way that you would set cookies on a client in terms of a web browser, the same way that it can actually persist specifically with this API client too. And you can kind of see that here in the top right section called cookies. And this is where it lets you manage the different cookies that are associated with those specific requests in your workspace. So what's great about this is that it really lets you be able to debug those, set new cookies if you wanted to as well, to be able to debug anything that has to do with cookies. And cookies are really great for session management, which is probably the more secure way of going than just going directly JSON Web Tokens. So, and that's obviously another topic, but cookies are a great way to be able to kind of keep your site essentially more secure. So pause there quickly. Billy, any questions?
I'm checking the comments. So far, so good. I think we're absorbing, like, I guess maybe this question is better for the end, but like as a hardcore EVM Web3 user, for these API calls, what would be the ideal purpose for me to be using Postman in my project, with API calls? Is that maybe through the smart contract level? Like if I'm doing Etherscan or anything like that, like what would be the personal use for me?
Yeah, so you can actually do two things with that. So one is you can use a provider service, like an RPC provider service that might be an abstracted version of that, like Etherscan, which has their own API endpoints.
Mm-hmm.
And that's nice. Is I think they actually have their own Postman collection that you can actually download as well.
Nice.
But I don't like
it's recorded. It's recorded, Manny. That's it. I'm going to quote you.
Yeah. Just double check whatnot. But what's nice is that most of these, like most service providers, end up creating a Postman file for people to download or start working with, because it's just a lot easier for them to say, hey, do you want to start working with this? Just download this collection from our site, and they can do that. So Etherscan would potentially have one, and you want to work directly with their API endpoints. The other thing you can do is, because if we look at what an RPC request is, an RPC request is still an HTTP request in that sense. So the only difference here is you're doing the same type of requests. You're probably doing a post instead, and the payload just for the body just needs to be done a little bit differently when it comes to RPC requests. So you can do like, hey, I want to do an API request as an RPC request to Anchor or another RPC provider, and be able to get the results or the payload for that. You can actually do that within Postman as well. So.
Quick question from the comments, and I don't know how relative it is because it's kind of out there, but can you post a learning doc? Now, is that specific to Ethers or Postman? Before I post it, I'm going to wait for that response. Yeah.
What did you maybe just clarification on like learning doc?
Yeah, I need a little clarification on that. Yeah, I'm going to throw that out there. But it is a question. We're going to see. But as we keep going, he's going to post that, and then we'll see what's going on. But yeah, I'm just kind of curious, like for my uses, like when would I do Postman in the mix? And it's kind of like, as I'm seeing, like I'm not utilizing the tools that are available to me because I didn't know they exist, or I didn't know these two fit together, So, something like an Alchemy RPC or, Pocket Network or something like as long as they have an RPC point, I can call that. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. And let me show, like, hopefully, I think this still exists, which is great. So let's enter an RPC, like that's here. So one of the RPC requests, like with Ethers, might be the client version in this sense. So let's just get that. You kind of see that, hey, I'm using Anchor's RPC Polygon Mumbai, and I'm performing a request to get the node version, or set the net version in that sense. So you can do those. Again, all those are HTTP requests. You can do the same thing here under Postman to be able to do, an HTTP request. The only difference is that you have to do your body in a specific format. Now, I don't have it like readily like the payload ready for this, but if you do want to see what that looks like, and let me just pull this up. This is like a small plug. Give me 2 seconds. I do have an article specifically on this, on RPC requests and what they like in terms of dissecting them and seeing what they look like. So if you do want to see what vanilla JavaScript in terms of RPC requests look like, you can look at.
As you're searching, we do have another question that was a little bit more details. Like, can you use it for the Arweave blockchain with Postman?
If they have any,
as you win the Arweave hackathon, right?
Yes. Funny enough, I actually used their, and the way that you would use it is through their gateways, right? So funny enough, that's actually how I won the competition. Was I didn't necessarily use an extracted version of like, hey, their SDKs or etc. I actually went directly to the source for their endpoints, to be able to load in and get the payload directly from like Warp's endpoint gateway, to be able to kind of get some of the data. And here's the article, by the way. So this is an article I recommend looking at. You can read, write 2 contracts, etc., and it shows you even the repository as to how do you make those RPC requests. Again, it is an API endpoint. Yeah, they're public URLs. You can be able to go through that process and make those requests even through Postman.
In the private chat, can you send that over to me so then I can post it into the YouTube chat? I'm just gonna DM you in the private chat right there, and then I can send it over to the YouTube folks.
I have lost the window.
Let me send it to you again.
Oh wait, here we go. Let me send it to you here.
I'm gonna send it anyway, just in case, as a backup. There's a lot of good content to swallow in there, so like it's just like anything I can send everybody would be great. So let me grab this link and go on, Manny. I got it.
Awesome. So let's go. Like, we've already established our first request, essentially, right? And I apologize for like jumping like crazy here. So we created our first request, but the idea is like, this is great for like one-off. You're doing something really quickly as a workflow. I do this all the time. I just like open something up and I'm going to make a request to it and just see if that works, right? And set the right payload in that sense. But if you're really kind of setting up and organizing an API, you'll kind of start to want to set up collections. And that's what collections is, really just a grouping of those endpoints. So you kind of save it. So let's create, a new collection here. We'll see it under collection, and we'll call this, we'll rename it as first collection. And what we can do here is we can save this under our first collection. And what I can do here is give it a name. We'll call it Health Said, so we have a better description, and we can kind of see what that looks like. And the nice thing about collections is to be able to kind of, if you usually want to set it up as like a version for an API endpoint or something like a service by itself. So that way, within a workspace, it has every type of endpoint that's available. If you're dealing with multiple services, you typically might want to use collections for one collection as per service. I know that Postman, what they do on their website is they try to associate, they've given examples where a collection would be related to like a model. So like in this case, you would have one for to-dos and you would have one for authentication, like separately. But what I've seen in practice is that we would use folders instead. So folders are great to be able to kind of keep everything within the collection still. So like, we'll show it Health Said rather. And it just makes it a lot easier. So you add all your endpoints under that specific collection. And that's how I've seen it done for multiple types of agencies, where we just kind of create multiple endpoints within a specific collection. Make sense?
Yep. I'm catching up here, as a Solidity dev. I'm like, all right, I'm catching with that fiddles with front end. I'm getting it.
So let's create our first endpoint for supporting to-dos in that sense, right? We've looked at, the URL, basically the endpoint, the methods that are supported. We've seen the payload kind of return, what the performance looks like, what the cookies look like. And additionally, sometimes you're like, hey, this is great for Postman, but like, I actually want to see what the code looks like if I want to do an actual request in a different language. You can also look here on the right-hand section under code, and it'll give you all the examples of what that looks like in curl, Node, Java, I believe Rust, PHP, all these things, to be able to kind of say, hey, I want to perform this exact same request just as a native function in a different platform, basically. So this is a great way also to be able to say, hey, I want to test this not just in Postman. Maybe there's something wrong with Postman, or there's some other configurations, and you want to double check it within it. So you can copy this, you can open it up like terminal and then run it and get the same result.
Nice. So that's a nice feature. Yeah.
So we've looked at this, like the obviously the results. So let's go and create our to-dos, because we have a standard to-do lcrud function. So if you're familiar with lcrud, lcrud is basically a convention for list, create, read, update, and delete. So we want to be able to list all the to-dos, create a to-do, read a specific to-do, update a specific to-do, and delete a specific to-do. So that's where we're going to kind of get to with being able to kind of support that. Let's briefly look at the code so that you have an idea of what that looks like. Again, this is app router, so a lot of this is new. So just as a convention, but you can kind of see here I have a get request on the root of the to-do under API. And then you can see here is that it actually goes through, I added some functionality so that you can kind of follow the conventions of limit and being able to say, hey, I only want 10, or I'm searching for something. You can kind of see what that looks like with Prisma's convention to be able to kind of sift through some of things and get a specific list as well. And then there's a create. So what it does is it validates the content type, making sure that it's application JSON as the payload, gets the payload as JSON. And then what it does is it does a small validation if it's saying that the to-do is required, or rather the task is required. And then what it does is creates that to-do and sends it back. So we can, let's do our first request in terms of listing things, and then let's try to create a to-do from here. So let's start off. I'm going to create a new function here. I'm going to go HTTP localhost and go under to-dos and click send. And you can kind of see that the payload is all returned. We've gotten, everything that we need in terms of, that standard list. And when I'm saying like those different conventions for limit and skip, you basically are adding query parameters here where we can actually filter the results based on the API. Not limit, but yeah, parse search results, limit one. I think that's something I need to fix. but basically the idea of sending query parameters within the URL to be able to filter some of that data as well. So anyways, that's our to-do. So let's save that under our list or whatnot. Let's save that under our to-dos. Let's set this as list. And let's create another one called create. So let's duplicate this one and rename it as create. And because a create is usually a post, I know that there's people argue for conventions between post, put, and patch. This is where, like, when people say true REST versus RESTful, RESTful is like, hey, it's like a little bit lazy with the conventions. And RESTful is so REST is like the actual conventions, where put usually replaces an entire entity, and patch is replacing just a specific attribute within that entity. So that's usually the standard, but most people end up sticking to get, post, delete, and put for some of those methods. And that's really why the definition is kind of RESTful, because it's more lazily following the convention. So here we'll have a post, and the thing I need to pass to it is actually the payload, so the body, and it's expecting JSON. So the first thing I'm going to do, because there is no JSON format that's set up here, I'll briefly go over what this is. But the form data is typically, if you want to do a basic HTML form, you can do file uploads. You can kind of do the same thing with form URL and code. Raw is something that you want to do in terms of different texts that you can do JSON, you can do HTML as passing some of the payload. You can set binary in terms of files as well. You can even use GraphQL to be able to hit this specific endpoint to really, if you have a GraphQL API server set up for Apollo. So let's use raw. And the first thing I'm going to do is pass it a JSON object where the task is need to get this workshop done. And we'll notice here, I'll send it and it should come back 200. Okay, the result is complete. And you'll see that the task is set to need to get this workshop done, where the default is complete is set to false. So we've basically done our create. So we've done from our lcrud list and create. And the next thing is our read. So I'm going to create another one. So I'll duplicate this one. Read. And the thing I need from here is I actually need the ID. So I'm going to copy that here and do a get. And let's do a internal server error. Interesting. Let's run this again. Sometimes an issue with SQLite, I think, with locally. So 1 second here. Internal server, let's list again. Everything's fine. Create, let's get our ID. And then under read, we got our to-dos and we're pasting the ID here. And for some reason, I'm getting errors. That's funny.
Live debugging, folks. This is it right here.
Let's see here. I have another service running. I'm just going to paste this here. Yep, and I've got an error specifically for this. That's funny. So I have another version here. I don't know why, but this is the case where I've like essentially the exact same request is going through and everything is showing correctly.
There you go.
So I won't go through all the entire process here, but you can kind of see like, hey, I've created an update. So the same idea of passing in a specific ID as a URL, and I'm updating a specific value to say is complete equal to true. And I can also do a deletion. So it's completely deleted and just returning back the payload to say something is actually deleted. So this is like LCRUD as it's basic. This convention exists with like any most services. Even if you're doing GraphQL, it's the same concept. Will be you want to get a list, you want to create a specific entity, you want to read it, you want to update it, you want to delete it. It's pretty standard. So perfect. So the next thing I want to do here is pause for questions briefly, but at the same time, I'll jump into tests to set things up. Bill, you have any questions?
No. I think I got the general gist of that. Like just recreating that form, that flow format is pretty standard. Like it's making sense to me. So if it's making sense to me, I think anybody in the front end world is kind of following along. But who knows? If we have questions, go for it. But right now, like we're flowing. I'm gonna ride that high of understanding.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So the one of the things is, hey, we have this API client. We want to be able to, test endpoints to be able to see some sort of data that's returned. But like maybe we have so many endpoints and we have a team of devs that are working on things. It's going to be kind of crazy to kind of go through here and actually verify every one of these attributes and make sure that the API is working exactly as it should, right? And this is where, one of the things that shines with Postman is being able to create tests. So the nice thing about tests is you can actually test the status code, the payload, the headers, all these things to be able to kind of automate the process a little bit more. So I'm going to run through what that looks like in terms of creating our first test. You'll see that I've chosen here under the test section. And the nice thing is they've even incorporated this new AI solution where you can write down what exactly you want to test and it'll try to create the proper code for you. But the thing to remember is that this is actually run using the convention of chai.js BGG. So like, let me just paste this here. This is following this convention for assertions, basically for tests. And we'll kind of see what that looks like in Postman. So here, I'm going to do my first check. I want to see if the header has been set to, or the status code is set to 200. So here, status code 200. Kind of see that here, it's 200. It's already been set. It's going to go PM, so Postman, response to have a status of 200. So now when I send this request, we'll see here under our test results that this specific test has passed. So this is a very, very simple implementation of tests. But at the same time, we're going to take a step further in terms of being able to understand this a little bit further. So now we have our, our status code. The next thing I want to do is be able to test the actual headers. So one of the things you'll note here is when I create things, if I go under my headers, my default for content type has been set to application JSON. And that's because my body is set to JSON And what I'm going to do is just untick that, and we'll kind of see here that it's going to give me an error, the invalid message, whatnot. The header is expecting application JSON. So what I want to do here is create a test to say, I want to make sure that the value is coming through correctly. I get the right message in terms of status code 200. I also want to make sure that the header that's returned is application JSON. And I also want to check that the body ID is set to need to get this workshop done, as an example. So let's start by writing those tests specifically. So we'll go under tests. Let's use our example for 200. We'll see here that it's passed. The next test I want to do is I want to test the headers. So header content type. And I believe it is, give me 1 second. I'm just trying to get the exact test for this.
Also, everybody in the chat or watching, if you have any questions, go ahead and feel free to ask. I'm going to throw that banner up again.
So here we have content type is present. So we'll see that content type is set. And then the next thing I'm going to do is test the payload to make sure that it is coming through correctly. So I'm going to say PM test, and I'm going to say, actually, we can take advantage of one of these snippets. So the response body. So let's say response.json is what we want to do. Actually, so not this one, but the response value checker. So I'm going to say JSON data. We're going to get the response as JSON. And I'm going to say JSON data, which is this object, dot task is equal to need to get this workshop done. So now if we run that, we'll see that 3 tests have been run, the status code check, the content type, as well as, this specific test, which is the task name. That again. So this is very simple. We're just basically gone through and we're like, hey, we've created tests specifically for post, and we've created tests for list as well. So this helps setting up a standard for being able to go through and test these and making sure that those endpoints are returning exactly what they're expected to return. But you can kind of imagine me having to go and click through each one of these doesn't make sense. It's just going to be just as tedious as like trying to manage these different types of tests in that sense. So that's where runner comes into effect. So runner is basically a way to run multiple tests within the actual collection, or even for that folder, and automate that process a little bit within Postman. So we can kind of see what that looks like. I'll go here into my folder and I go run folder. So here is the list of different endpoints within that folder that I want to run the tests. And the nice thing is that you can actually do performance metrics if you want to. You can say, I'm going to run this manually, go over multiple iterations. So let's say if the value changes for some reason on the second iteration, you can kind of see what that looks like. And you can also add delays. So delays would be like, hey, if you have API rate limiting, you might want to add certain delays between each request so that you don't fall into those pitfalls where the request gets delayed. And you can also persist the data. So in this sense, if you want to persist the data, it's just to be able to see what the result looks like. If you don't check this, then basically the payload returns would just show blank and just say, hey, the test actually passed. So let's run this. I run it the first time. We can kind of see it's gone through the entire check of different tests. This is passed for 200. Let's just zoom in a little bit. So for to-dos has done, so that's the list. Under create, this is passed, and there's no test for set for read, but you can kind of see that it's gone through and done all the tests for that specific folder. Now, the nice thing is that you can also apply that to, the collection. I can just run the actual collection as well, as opposed to just the folder, and go through all the tests to make sure that, hey, the API is working exactly as it should. So this is one of the number one features that most devs end up using, because they want to say, hey, I just got an API. I just got API documentation from, a new service that I'm working with. How do I know that everything is actually working as it should be? And you'll run a runner test and say, like, which features are not working properly, and it just makes it a lot easier to kind of go through that and do a quick audit specifically for that API.
This is so much better than my console log on my front end.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's literally how I do it.
I mean, I still do that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, but at the same time, this is a great way to be able to kind of organize that and be able to test those specific endpoints.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
definitely.
um, so one thing I want to do here, and then let's actually go back to the first runner state. We kind of see we can actually click here and let me zoom out. Actually see the summaries for some of these, whatnot, to be able to say, hey, this is the persistent state. So you can kind of see here going through the tests. You can even dive down deeper in terms of saying, hey, this makes sense. The payload makes sense and why it passed in that sense. So you can kind of imagine, though, you're like, okay, I can run all these requests. I can do all these things, but let's say for some reason, I delete a to-do, in that sense, and I tried to read it afterwards and it doesn't come through correctly. I don't know why this one is specifically giving me an error, but you can kind of imagine if you deleted something and you try to read it afterwards, it'll give you an error, and it's basically not, it's not going to be able to kind of handle things correctly. And this is where you can take advantage of something called environment variables that are local to Postman, which is great. You can actually set up environment variables for different environments in terms of local, maybe staging or production. This is a great way to be able to kind of keep that and be able to not have to manage like those variables in a central place and not have to repeat yourself. So one of the major ways to be able to handle environment variables a little bit easier is setting the URL for the actual API endpoint. So we'll start by going in the top right here, and we're going to create a new environment, okay? And I'm going to call this local environment, or just local. And the variable I'm going to set here is my base URL, my initial value, and it'll automatically populate my current value. So just to kind of give you an idea what initial value is and how it differs from current value is, whenever you load your project, your initial value will always persist as to what that was the first time, and you can use it multiple times. But as you progress through the app and you can do changes to actual environment variables, you'll see what the current state is. So you can kind of say, hey, this is what it should be at the base, and then what its current state is and how it's been manipulated. So to not overwrite the existing defaults, essentially. So here I have a base URL. I'm going to go back to my list. And what I'm going to do is just replace this with 2 curly brackets.
It's a little hard to see right now when you switch the screen, so it's a little bit smaller. Yeah, thank you.
Well, let's set this to local, and we can actually, it actually does autofill to be able to say base URL. So now I have my base URL set. I can use my environment variables. I don't have to retype that. And let's say I wanted to switch over to another environment. Let's say I created another one for production. I could duplicate this and then modify the base URL for my production or my staging URL and easily test that or test those particular suites. So it's not just local, and it'll just replace this URL and the endpoints still stay the same. And you can kind of see everything works correctly. So that's like one way that you can kind of use environment variables, very, very basic way to be able to use environment variables for the URL. But there's another way you can use environment variables, which is with tests as well. So I'm going to create a few different environment variables that you can kind of see what I'm going to do here to be able to take advantage of what that looks like. So here I'm going to create, let's go under edit. I'm going to create 2 temp to do environment variables. So I'm going to call it temp to do task. I'm going to call this temp to do is complete. And I'm going to set this one to temp to do ID. So I don't care about the defaults. These are temps. I'm going to be using these to kind of use the information going back and forth to be able to set variables and then be able to modify. I really don't care about these, but it's great to be able to have that and modify it and go through the list. So one of the things is, let's use the create as an example. You'll notice here I have a payload that is going through. And one thing is, I want to check that that payload isn't always the same payload. I want to see that if I did something else, like a different type of task, like a different text or a different value that's being sent as a payload, I want to check if that payload was actually sent, right? I don't want it to be the same consistent one, because that might give me a false positive in terms of, hey, the request actually went through. So what I'm going to do here is take advantage of something called pre-request scripts. And this is interesting because what you can do is, just before the request happens, you can do some modifications or set things up so that request has everything it needs to be able to perform, or the payload it needs to be able to perform the next step. So I'm just going to replace here, because this is bugging me, the base URL. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get or set a variable in this sense. So I'm going to bear with me here. I'm just going to set this prescript. Prescript, I believe it's under, sorry, I'm just getting the code here.
Again, as we're waiting, if there's any other questions out there, don't be afraid to ask. No worries.
Yeah, there's no judgments or anything when it comes to this. This is a lot to kind of take in. So let's use JavaScript to create a new alphanumeric value. So this is basically something that's just going to be, random gibberish in terms of an alphanumeric value. Okay. What I'm doing here is saying I want to create this value because I want to check that that value is what was actually created within, what was returned in terms of the endpoint. So I'm going to create a new task. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set the variable of the environment variable that we just did of temp to do task to that new temp task. Okay. So basically, just before the request happens, it comes up with a random value and then sets it to the environment variable. Now, what's nice is that after, when we go into our body, we can now replace this value with our temp to do task. And when we perform a request again, let's look at the body, we can kind of see that that gibberish has been created. So now we're able to be able to create random values, store them, that persist in a variable, and use that to now be able to test it, to say, hey, did that value actually come through exactly as I set it prior? So that make sure that I don't get a false positive. So here's an example. Remember how we set it to, it failed here where the task name didn't match what was valued, what was the value that was generated. We can actually pull in the environment variable as well. So PM environment get, and then we're going to go temp to do task. Now, when I run it, you can kind of see that it always passes, but it always generates a new value every time I run it to make sure that there's no false positives that are coming through for those specific tests. So now I'm able to automate even the process of coming up with values to make sure that I'm testing for those scenarios too. And let's just take it a step further. I'm going to add here just a complete as well. And Billy, if you have any questions, let me know.
Yeah. It's kind of thinking off the top of my head, like if you have, like I've tried to do something like that, but I have a limited API calls. You're running your own server. So like you're based on the limit of the API calls of whatever API you may be calling, right? So you need to have like a key set up in there in order to make those calls pass maybe 5 per second or something, like if you're running a deep test.
Yeah, so that's nice. When we looked at the runner folder again, you can add those delays. So if you know that it's like 100 requests per hour or something like that, you can add those, or 100 requests per minute in that sense. You can add those delays to make sure that you're testing it appropriately. Nice. You could potentially even use it as a way, as like a running service, to be able to just populate data that you need for a service as well, right? So if you're like, yeah, I don't want to come up with a script for this, I can just use Postman and go through the process of just populating things too.
Postman's got everything. That's awesome.
So we're here under create. The only thing I'm going to do here is basically I created an array and I'm going to do a random value of 0 or 1 and then get whether or not it's complete or not, the true or false. And then set that as the body. So here under is complete, I'm going to set it to temp to do is complete. Now when I save it, we'll see that it's set to false. If I run it a couple times, you'll see true. So it just randomly chooses a value as well, so that we can also test if that is not a false positive, where it's a consistent value going through. So this is a way that you can kind of use environment variables to be able to do mass testing and kind of make your workflow a little bit easier and more manageable for other developers as well. So I definitely recommend using environment variables as much as possible. Next up is, like, you can imagine here under tests, and we're going to do another optimization, is like I'm going to do a PM status code 200 for every single one of these requests. That doesn't necessarily make any sense, right? It's just like it's the same thing over and over again. Why would I need to copy and paste that, right? Well, the nice thing is that how the way folders and collections work is that you can actually set tests that are folder wide as well as collection wide. So I can actually delete all this as it has been consistent, even this 200, and then apply it to the folder itself to be able to do those tests. So now if I run that folder, or when I run that create, it still performs the tests that we talked about, and it's able to do its individual tests as well. So you can do global tests too to make your optimization even further optimized in that sense. So it's, again, like small things that you're trying to do to really really avoid repeating yourself for code that you're going to be reusing over and over again. All right, so the next step, and I realize we're getting to an hour in that sense, but the one thing I really wanted to show off, and this is the thing that I think that is probably what most people want to use, and I use personally, and there's other solutions for this as well, but I think this is a great way to be able to avoid also vendor lock-in if they're worried about just Postman in general, is being able to do automated tests, right? Actually, just before that, I just briefly want to show you how authorization kind of works a little bit so that you kind of understand what authorizations actually exist within Postman and how it kind of supports that. So I'm going to just create a new folder here. There we go, folder, and we're just going to call it auth. And in auth, I actually have two endpoints set up in my API for base auth. So a base 64 auth. This is not the most secure, but some services require you to use a base 64 auth and a JSON Web Token auth, right? Which just decodes a JSON Web Token to kind of show you how that natively is supported within Postman. So here I'm going to create a new one called base auth, a new request. So it's a base URL. And it's auth, and it's basic. So if I did this, it's not going to return anything. It's probably going to give me an error because it's not actually getting any of the payloads for the headers for the authorization. What you can do here is under authorization, there's a wide variety of different conventions for security for authorization. And the one we're going to use for this one for basic is just basic auth. And you'll notice here I set a username and password, right? What this does is it takes that, it creates a base 64 encoded version of these two plus a comma together, and then sends that in the header as a basic auth. And you kind of see it's been decoded here. We can kind of see also the headers that we're sending. So here under base 64, you can kind of see that base 64 encoded of the username and password that's being sent. So this is a way that you can kind of take advantage of authorization that's native directly within Postman, as opposed to trying to code it yourself or try to do some shimming to be able to do a base 64 encoded of that username. There is another request. Let's save this under auth quickly. First collection, auth, and we'll call this basic. Next one I'm going to create is a JSON Web Token version of this. So let's rename this to JWT as another example. And let's change this to JSON Bearer Token. JSON, Bearer Token. That's the one I need. So here I'm going to paste just so you can kind of see where I'm getting this from. I'm going to go jwt.io. I'm just going to copy this JSON Web Token and then paste that into the token here, and I can send it off. Oops. That's because it's probably getting I set the secret for here. But basically what you can do is by setting that, that's basic. I need to set it to JSON Web Token. And you can kind of see that it's been parsed here for the exact same values for that JSON Web Token. The nice thing you can also do with this is that let's say you have let's say you have a JSON web token and it's going to be dynamically generated or retrieved from another service, you can also use environment variables here as well. So if I wanted to, I could set a new environment variable for JWT, paste the value in there, and go to my JWT here, and I can pass in JWT, and it works as well as an environment variable. So another optimization for you to be able to use that. So there's obviously some other solutions you can use, like Auth 2.0, which is great. You can go through the entire login process if you wanted to do with like Google or Twitter or Facebook for that matter. It'll actually go through the login process. You obviously need some configurations done with this to be able to set it correctly, but it'll actually go through the process, prompt a window for you, and do the authentication process all through Postman. So that way you can actually verify that things are working from their end, as opposed to trying to build out this entire server that may not work correctly, and you find out that their service isn't working correctly either. So it's a great way to be able to do quick authentications, quick verification of authentication as well.
Manny, you just saved me so much time with all the drama I'm dealing with right now. So this right here, that section right here is all worth it. That was good.
Yeah, it'll be like, honestly, I would love, it's probably not in the scope of this, but like I've done it through Twitter. I've done it through so many authentication processes where this makes it a lot easier to kind of go through it, and it'll generate the actual access token that you need to be able to perform further requests to. So this is a great tool to test, public APIs as well. All right. So this is the moment of truth as to what I recommend doing from time to time. And there's actually existing services that do this as well. But this is something that I have typically done. I don't always recommend doing this, but from time to time you want to. If you feel like your collection is at a point where it's like, hey, this is exactly where it needs to be. I don't need to there's not necessarily much that's changing in terms of the endpoints, in terms of the payload. And that's usually for REST. You typically want to version it like version 1 or version 2 to kind of differentiate. But I'm going to pull in my finished version of this in terms of all the tests I have. And I have this one called Newman. Now, the interesting thing about Newman is that Newman is the CLI version of Postman. So what's interesting is that you can run all these tests that we're doing in a UI and do it in the CLI in a terminal, and just automate the process from there as well. So I don't even need to I can do all the configurations I want here, and then I can export those configurations and those environments, and then run the tests locally within the actual repository. And the cool thing about that, when you do that, is that then you can actually add it to a CI/CD process of being able to automatically verify it. So like somebody introduces a new feature, it gets published as a PR, GitHub Actions runs the actual CLI, runs the endpoint, and says, hey, this failed at this specific test. There's something that's weird here, and you're able to identify it and catch it before it actually goes to production. So this is what I loved. And the only issue with Newman is that when you save the collections, and sometimes I would do that, save the collections directly in the repository, is that there's a ton of changes to those configuration files. So if you're okay with them, you just commit them. But if you're not, it'll look like crazy for those Git diffs in terms of how much has changed. So let me go through the process of what this looks like in terms of that collection. So I have a collection. I'm going to go, I believe it's here under export. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to export it under here. So I already have an exported collection. So this is the Newman Postman collection. I recommend naming things without any spaces because it just makes things a lot easier. But that saves the entire collection here as a JSON file. Now, the one thing is you'll notice that I'm using environment variables here, right? So how does it reference environment variables? Well, you can export the environment variable as well to be able to use that as a means for your automated process as well. So I'll go here, go to export, and I've already have one for local in terms of my environment, and utilize that. So I have my collection, I have my environments, and I've saved that. Now I'm going to go through the process of automating the tests directly within my repository. So here, let's switch over. I'm going to stop the server. I'm going to take advantage of a tool or an NPM package called Start, and I think it's called Start and Test Server. Let me just double check here. Yeah, Start Server and Test. So this is actually an NPM package. So I installed this. What this does is say start the server. So like an npm run task, which I'm passing as dev, and then it's going to listen for port 3000 to say, hey, is the server up? If it is up, then I want you to run this specific script afterwards. So it's nice in one line. I'm able to start the server and test it. And you kind of notice here, I've downloaded, I installed the Newman package, which is in my node modules.bin. I'm going to run and reference the Postman collection. So here under Newman Postman collection. And then I'm also going to pass it a -e. So to say this is the environment variable I'm going to reference as well. So that when it references those variables, it knows which environment variables to pull in to replace them. So here, I'm going to go pm test Newman. And you can kind of see here, it'll do a pm dev, listens for that specific server. And then what I'll do is go through the entire process of Newman of testing all the endpoints that we just created. So data ID, task, the status codes, the content type is present, etc. Now we've done this entirely in the CLI, and we didn't need to do that directly in Postman. So we can configure all these things in Postman, get it to the point where we like it, save that file, save it within our repository. And now we can do things where we can add things to our Gitflow work process. This isn't fully working yet, but I'll try to update the repository hopefully later today or this week. But you can do things where I've created a GitHub action where it pulls in the repo, right? Installs the values, copies the environment variable, right? To make sure that that we're able to run SQLite, and then just does yarn test Newman, right? And then in that CLI process, we're able to catch that for new PRs to see if something failed specifically as well. So
we definitely need a workshop on GitHub Actions, especially when you're working with other people to do checks and balances. Pretty much,
yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, if the community wants it, we're going to do it. But I personally need it.
Yeah.
Like why? But definitely, yeah.
Yeah, GitHub Actions are great. There's a lot of different things that you like. There's a lot of CI/CD processes that you can use as well, not just with GitHub Actions. You can use obviously Circle CI, Travis CI. You can also use Amazon has their own, like I believe it's called Pipeline. Obviously GitHub Actions, and then Vercel. There's a way where you can kind of use GitHub Actions with Vercel as well to avoid things getting pushed, so that hey, I'm going to catch something before it actually gets published to my Vercel deployment or staging for that matter. So this is what I'm was most excited about when it comes to just tests in general, is that it really kind of sets it up so that you can go through the entire process of working with the team and say, hey, send me your repository. Let me do a quick audit. I'm just going to run all the tests, test all the endpoints, see if everything is working correctly. It's all local. But if I wanted to, I could test it on production, just specify a new environment variable, like environment file to reference, and go and test all those endpoints automatically as well. So the great thing with Postman is it's really a platform. You can go through, test all these endpoints. You can document them. You can share them. You can version them in terms of sharing with other people. You can even go through the process, like I think I mentioned before, is going through and creating documentation for those definitions of those endpoints. And you can share that value as a public URL and share it with other developers saying, hey, you can use this and take this and start working with it. And even here, you'll see some other services that have set up. You can go through, they've already published theirs to Postman, and you can find things for like Twitter, for that matter, Facebook, other Postman collections, and you can start working with them because they're all publicly available, because people just end up using it because it's the easiest way to work with teams in that sense. So that's like Postman in its entirety in terms of being able to deal with its workflow. Now, there's other things to it. Obviously, there's templates, there's public collections, there's workflows, there's mock servers you can create. There's even monitoring where you can set it up, say, hey, I want to do a health check on specific endpoints to see, hey, are things working correctly? And make sure to check, hey, are these endpoints working as expected? Are they always up? You can export as a standard for Open API, where it follows the JSON schema. You can also do RPC requests directly, or because they're all API endpoints. And the nice new thing, not that I see a lot of people being able to use this from the community just yet, but you can, on top of REST, like HTTP as an API, you can use GraphQL, but you can also use WebSockets and gRPC. And gRPC is another way that you can actually perform API requests. This is using protobufs, which is a different way to be able to communicate to servers. It's usually what Google ends up using, where they're doing server-to-server communication, and it's very, very, very effective in terms of just for speed in terms of processing. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do with Postman. And if you have a chance to start working with it, and look at the repo that I posted to be able to start working with it too, because everything is in theirs too. Woo.
That was a lot to swallow, Manny. I'm gonna have to go back, literally watch this video again to get some of the pieces that like I may have missed with the repo. But like, I mean, it makes sense to use Postman, especially when you're testing like large production environments and you have like these tests that you do and you can do it CLI is kind of cool. Like that would help me a lot. Just again, like checking different variables when you post something is huge, because I've been doing it manually. So like I didn't even know that it exists. So the time it's gonna save me is just gonna be dope.
Yeah, and you can, like, what I end up doing, I recommend, is like what you'll notice is that for some of the projects I'm creating, it, like if you're doing a hackathon or something that's like you want to get up and running, it doesn't always make sense to go npm create next or npm create like create your own templates, right? Where you know that things are working directly, and you'll see me like even on my repositories or whatnot, you'll see like things that are like no TS bootstrap, rest with Auth0, quick VS, like all these are templates for me to start working off of, so that I don't have to deal with it. And I know that it's working as it should. And I've already set up tests that say, hey, this is exactly as sure. And I'll just extend that for whatever function I need, and saving me tons and tons of time. And this is where tests come in. If you're trying to build a more robust application, you want to test things, build it out for maybe not for your MVP, but if you're dealing with another service that is already production grade, again, like Twitter's API or Medium's or Facebook's for that matter, you'll want to use and create your own specific endpoints to test against and really verify if all that data is actually coming through correctly and you're getting the everything is just working as expected for your service. So yeah.
Tips from the senior. That's it. Take them. Awesome, Manny. Thank you. Go for it.
Pleasure.
Any closing?
I was just going to say, if there's any last minute questions, happy to answer. Otherwise, you can always hit me up on Twitter if you have a specific question in regards to Postman, and I'd happy to go through it too.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, those that don't know Manny, he hangs out from time to time in the VC5 chat, always willing to, share the wealth of knowledge that he has, or we're just sitting around talking shit, one or the other, one or the other. But yeah, definitely reach out. Like, again, this is all skills, no shills, like literally leveling up. I've never really used Postman other than like, oh, this is what it does. And I click an API call. I was like, okay, cool. So like learning like the ins and outs of this and like understanding why it works for me is like huge. And like that's what we're looking for in the community workshop. So like if you are in the community and like, hey, I wish I learned this, and like, there's like 20 hours. I don't want to learn the history of Postman. I don't want to know like the guy that lived in a shack to say, oh, I decided to make Postman, because I don't care about any of that. How do I use it? How can I apply it to what I need? That's what we're looking for, community workshops. So, definitely, recap it. This video is going to be on the DevDAO YouTube. It'll also be in the DevDAO Twitter. So like if you missed the piece of it, I see you, Walnuts. It's you can catch it on the YouTube at any time. It's going to be a recorded stream. I don't think it's a weekly stream. So the community workshops, yeah, well, community workshops are kind of like this. I don't want to feel like I have to make one. I want to be consistent, but I don't want to feel like I have to get somebody in front of a camera and it's not good, or it's not what the community wants. So it is going to be like what the community wants, and I can find someone that can do it like well, then it's going to be a community workshop. So like that's going to be the new standard for me, going like, I don't want to feel the pressure. I got to get this guy, or I need a filler or whatever. Like if the community loves a certain topic, we're going to go with it. And if the same person can do that topic, amazing. If I have to find somebody else, or we can do part series. I know Thresh, people love Thresh. We're going to do a Kubernetes pretty soon with Thresh. We're just figuring it out, right? But like, if there's something you guys are dying to learn, like that's not going to be sponsored or just tons of content that's going to be used for you, then we're going to go. And how do you join the community? You can one, join a hackathon and basically get sponsored to get in for free, which is popping up, I think, next week. We'll make an announcement. I think we'll make an announcement Thursday. So you can get a sponsorship in there. All you have to do is actually submit something of worthiness. I want to say, I don't want to say submit nonsense, but something good. Put some effort, right? And then two, you can buy the code tokens on Uniswap through Guild XYZ. You can check that out. But just follow DevDAO. You're going to see lots of opportunities to get in non-financially. And Krinza, are wants to know if you're available coding to do all her thumbnails for all her future work on there. So, let her know.
That's a full-time job, isn't it? Right?
Yeah. I mean, that's a different rate. I'm pretty sure that's higher than the normal dev rate, but you never, hey, I'm not here to block opportunity. So anyways, thank you so much. Coding with Manny. Make sure to follow Coding with Manny. Make sure to follow DevDAO. And if you're wild and you want to follow my stupid takes, you can follow me at the weirdest Twitter handle, WC49358. Yeah, we'll catch you on the next workshop. Thank you again so much, Manny. We'll catch you around.
Got it. Thanks, man.